In the winter of 1887, Scotland Yard quietly sealed a case file that would not be reopened for more than 90 years. Locked away behind iron cabinets and bureaucratic silence, it contained detailed accounts of 7 murders that had stalked London's most privileged district for 8 long months. Each victim had been discovered with the same precise carving etched into the flesh of their chest, and each bore traces of an unfamiliar substance that left their faces frozen in expressions of grotesque, ecstatic laughter. What unsettled investigators most was not simply the methodical nature of the killings, but a detail that defied reason. Witnesses, reliable men and women of standing, reported hearing laughter echoing through the victims' homes hours after death had been formally confirmed by police surgeons. Not imagined chuckles, not distant street noise, but clear, sustained human laughter resonating through darkened rooms long after life had fled the body. The case came to an abrupt and unexplained end when its lead investigator, Inspector Edmund Harwick, vanished without a trace. The only thing he left behind was a brief handwritten note discovered on his desk. It read simply, "The laughter never stops. It follows you home." What the authorities buried was not only evidence of a killer's methods, but proof of how far Victorian society's elite would go to protect their reputations, even if it meant allowing a murderer to move freely through the fog-choked streets of the empire's capital. London in 1887 stood at the zenith of its power. Queen Victoria's Golden Jubilee had filled the city with weeks of celebration, parades rolling down the Mall beneath banners and brass bands. The empire stretched across continents, from tea plantations in Ceylon to diamond mines in South Africa, and the city pulsed with confidence and wealth. Gas lamps lined the streets like earthbound stars, casting restless shadows across Georgian terraces and the newer Victorian mansions of the industrial aristocracy. The air itself seemed heavy with empire, coal smoke sweetened by salt from the Thames, the constant clatter of hansom cabs, the hum of a city that never truly slept. By day, clerks, merchants, and servants flowed through the streets in endless streams. By night, London became something else entirely. Pools of yellow light floated in seas of shadow, and entire streets vanished between one lamp and the next. Belgravia was the crown jewel of this world. A carefully planned district of white stucco townhouses and manicured garden squares, it was home not to ancient nobility, but to new wealth. Railroad barons, shipping magnates, and textile kings whose fortunes had been forged in the furnaces of the Industrial Revolution. Their homes stood as monuments to ambition and global dominance. Among them were the Harringtons. Their wealth flowed from cotton mills across Manchester and Lancashire, where thousands of laborers fed the looms that built the family fortune. Lord Charles Harrington, stern and watchful behind steel-gray whiskers, had purchased his Belgrave Square mansion for £12,000, a price reflecting not just architecture, but status. Lady Margaret Harrington, decades younger and shaped by privilege, presided over glittering dinners that drew politicians, financiers, and cultural figures into her orbit. Inspector Edmund Harwick had walked these streets for 15 years. He had risen from a constable in the brutal alleys of Whitechapel to one of Scotland Yard's most respected detectives. Educated, methodical, and restrained, he moved easily among the upper classes when duty required, though his hands still bore the calluses of his youth in a Hampshire blacksmith's forge. He lived alone near the British Museum, surrounded by books and silence, a man whose life had narrowed until justice itself became his sole companion. That autumn, London's fogs arrived early and thick, not poetic mists, but choking yellow shrouds born of coal smoke and river air. On certain nights, Visibility fell to mere yards. Gas lamps seemed to hover in emptiness, and familiar streets turned alien. Even lifelong Londoners lost their way. It was during one such night, on October 15th, that the first scream tore through Belgrave Square. Lady Margaret Harrington returned early from a charity gala at the Royal Opera House, her cab creeping through fog so dense the driver called warnings into the murk. Wagner droned endlessly in her memory as she stepped down, weary and longing only for tea and quiet. When the cab pulled away, she saw at once that something was wrong. Her front door stood ajar. Warm gaslight spilled into the fog like an invitation. Mrs. Elena Whitfield, her head housekeeper of 23 years, would never have allowed such a thing. Never once had she neglected her duties. Lady Margaret climbed the steps, silk slippers clicking on damp stone, calling softly into the darkness. The fog swallowed her voice. Inside, the gas jets flickered as cold air moved through the hall. The house felt wrong, unsettled. In the drawing room, Mrs. Whitfield lay sprawled across the Persian carpet, her body arranged with deliberate care. Her silver hair had been fanned around her head like a halo. Her hands were folded neatly upon her chest. Her face was frozen in rapturous laughter. Not a grimace, not hysteria. Pure, unrestrained joy, as though she had died in the middle of a perfect joke. The room around her told a different story. Furniture lay overturned. A Chinese vase shattered near the hearth. Books were strewn across the floor, curtains torn down, porcelain crushed beneath velvet cushions. Violence had lived here. Inspector Harwick arrived at dawn, the fog thinning just enough for the city's morning sounds to seep back in. He stood silently over the body, absorbing every detail: the bruising at the throat, the torn fingernails, the shallow carving just below the collarbone. A theatrical mask, comedy and tragedy fused into one unsettling symbol. The scent troubled him most. Not death, something sweeter, medicinal, complex, familiar. Witnesses came forward reluctantly. One neighbor, Mrs. Gertrude Pembroke, confessed that she had heard laughter coming from the Harrington residence well past 2 a.m, long after the surgeon had placed Mrs. Whitfield's death near midnight. It had gone on for nearly an hour, joyful and relentless, unsettling enough that she had closed her curtains and prayed for sleep. The newspapers were cautious. The Times buried the story. Penny papers were not so discreet. By week's end, Belgravia whispered of the laughing man. Harwick dug deeper. Mrs. Whitfield had been a devoted servant, stern but kind, respected by the household. Yet several staff mentioned odd behavior in recent weeks. She had spoken aloud to unseen companions, practiced accents, performed voices in empty rooms as though rehearsing for an unseen audience. The mask, the laughter, the performance. Harwick turned his attention to the theaters of the West End, where grief and joy were rehearsed nightly beneath gaslight. There, amid velvet seats and painted faces, he heard whispers of a solitary gentleman who laughed during scenes of death, whose mirth echoed when silence was expected. A man who understood performances too well. 3 weeks later, the laughter returned. 3 weeks after Mrs. Whitfield's death, as winter tightened its grip and the fogs grew heavier, the laughter claimed another life. This time the victim was Mr. Geoffrey Cavendish, younger brother of the powerful tea importing dynasty, found dead in his private study on Chester Square. The discovery was made just after dawn by his manservant, William Hartley, a nervous young man still new to service. He arrived to light the fires and prepare breakfast, only to find the study door locked from within. No response came to his knocking, A locksmith was summoned, and when the door finally gave way, the scene inside silenced everyone present. Geoffrey Cavendish sat upright in his favorite leather armchair, positioned beside the fireplace where he spent most evenings reading. He wore his burgundy velvet smoking jacket. His head rested comfortably against the chair's high back. At first glance, he looked merely asleep. Then they saw his face. Like Mrs. Whitfield before him, Cavendish's features were frozen in an expression of ecstatic laughter. Mouth open in delight. Eyes crinkled with joy. A moment of perfect amusement preserved beyond death. Unlike the Harrington drawing room, there were no signs of struggle, no overturned furniture, no broken objects. The study was immaculate. Books lined the shelves exactly as they always had. A single leather-bound volume lay open in his lap, a collection of comedic plays by Oscar Wilde. The page was marked at a passage from The Importance of Being Earnest, Lady Bracknell's musings on propriety and composure. Inspector Harwick felt a cold unease settle into his bones. The police surgeon placed Cavendish's time of death between 10 and 11 that evening. Yet neighbors told another story. Mrs. Adelaide Petton, the elderly widow in the adjoining townhouse, reported hearing laughter echoing through the walls until well past 3 in the morning. Not brief amusement, but sustained mirth that came and went in waves, loud enough to haunt her dreams even after she took a sleeping powder. The pattern was undeniable now. Laughter outliving life. Cavendish's background offered no obvious connection to Mrs. Whitfield. He was educated, wealthy, immersed in London's cultural circles, a patron of the theatre, a man who hosted salons filled with playwrights, critics, and thinkers. Oscar Wilde himself had been a frequent guest. Cavendish was particularly interested in the emerging science of psychology, fascinated by the relationship between emotion and physical expression. The breakthrough came from Constable Thornbury. While searching the study, he noticed a loose panel behind the massive desk. Inside was a hidden compartment containing a small leather diary. Its pages, filled with Cavendish's precise hand, documented a growing obsession with what he called authentic human emotion. He wrote of polite society as a theater, of laughter and grief as rehearsed performances rather than genuine feeling. One entry stood out. He described attending a dinner where he observed Lady Harrington's housekeeper, a woman of remarkable theatrical sensibility, whose laughter during conversation seemed unfiltered, unrestrained, real. Unlike the careful smiles of the guests, hers appeared authentic. He expressed interest in studying her reactions under controlled conditions. Another entry mentioned contact with Dr. H, experiments involving chemical induction of emotional states, compounds capable of overriding social conditioning. The final entry, written just 2 days before his supposed death, chilled Harwick. "The work begins tomorrow night," it read. "I have volunteered to be the first subject." Geoffrey Cavendish had not been an unwilling victim. He had been a participant. Hidden beneath the diary were letters signed only with the initial H. They spoke of chemistry, consciousness, and the belief that true emotion could be chemically revealed once society's masks were stripped away. As Harwick read, a horrifying picture formed. These were not crimes of passion or madness, but experiments. Harwick traced the initial H to Dr. Sebastian Hartwell, a former physician whose career had collapsed 3 years earlier after accusations of unauthorized experiments at Bethlehem Royal Hospital. Once promising, Hartwell had become obsessed with the physical manifestations of emotion, particularly facial expression. His license revoked, he vanished into obscurity. When Harwick located Hartwell's former lodgings in Bloomsbury, the rooms were empty. But behind a false wall, he discovered a hidden laboratory, glass retorts, chemical powders, notebooks filled with formulas and observations. One passage made his breath catch. Subject displays involuntary laughter approximately 15 minutes after administration. Effect persists for 6 hours after cessation of vital functions. Reports soon followed of intrusions into the homes of Belgravia's elite. Nothing stolen, but books disturbed. Volumes on psychology, anatomy, theater. A woman on Belgrave Square reported being watched from the fog by a well-dressed gentleman who studied her house as though she were a specimen. The connection emerged with sickening clarity. All of them had attended Hartwell's lectures at the Royal Institution, including Mrs. Whitfield. Somehow she had gained access. Cavendish had been a regular attendee, often staying behind to speak with the doctor. The victims were not random, they were chosen. As winter deepened, Harwick realized he was no longer chasing a murderer, but a man conducting systematic human experimentation. Each death was a demonstration, each frozen smile, proof of theory. The final piece came from a young medical student, Thomas Whitmore. Shaken by what he had witnessed, he came forward after reading of Cavendish's death. He described a hidden laboratory near the docks where Hartwell conducted experiments on volunteers and later unwilling subjects. Compounds inducing terror, despair, and euphoria. Hartwell called his greatest creation the essence of joy. Whitmore provided directions, habits, details. And then, on a fog-shrouded December evening, Inspector Harwick received an invitation. Hand-delivered, elegant, written in Hartwell's distinctive script. An invitation to the Adelphi Theatre. Midnight, to witness the culmination of his research. Harwick knew it was a trap, but duty left him no choice. He prepared quietly, arranged distant backup, armed himself, and stepped into the fog one final time. The theater stood dark, silent, its grand facade looming like a mausoleum. Inside, corridors echoed with the ghosts of past performances. From the auditorium came voices, more than one. On the stage, illuminated by a single calcium light, stood Dr. Sebastian Hartwell, and beside him, very much alive, was Geoffrey Cavendish. They had never intended to stop. As Hartwell spoke of science and truth, of stripping humanity bare, Harwick understood the final horror. He had been led here deliberately, every clue planted, every step guided. He was to be the final subject. The vial in Hartwell's hand glimmered faintly, terror distilled. But Edmund Harwick had survived 15 years in London's darkest streets, and he was not finished yet. But Inspector Harwick had survived 15 years in London's darkest streets by never surrendering to inevitability. As Hartwell descended from the stage, vial in hand, and Cavendish watched with detached fascination, Harwick reached calmly into his waistcoat. In one swift motion, he produced a small pocket mirror and angled it upward. The calcium light flared back into their eyes with blinding intensity. Hartwell cried out, staggering. Cavendish recoiled, cursing as his vision failed him. In that instant, the theater's long-dead silence shattered into chaos. What followed was brief, violent, and desperate. Harwick lunged forward, driving Cavendish to the floor with a force born not of anger, but resolve. Years of training overcame education and privilege. Cavendish struck the stage boards hard, unconscious before he could rise. Hartwell, blinded and disoriented, stumbled backward toward the orchestra pit, clutching the vial as though it were sacred. His heel caught the edge. He fell. The glass shattered on impact, releasing its contents into the air. The vapors rose, colorless, invisible. Hartwell inhaled them fully before he could scream. Cavendish, still breathing shallowly on the stage, followed moments later. By the time Scotland Yard arrived, drawn at last by Harwick's distant signal, the experiment had ended. The arrests of Dr. Sebastian Hartwell and Geoffrey Cavendish sent shockwaves through Victorian London. The trial that followed, held at the Old Bailey in the spring of 1888, became one of the most disturbing proceedings of the era. Beneath gaslit chandeliers and the watchful gaze of packed galleries, the full scope of their collaboration was revealed. Hartwell's compounds were far beyond anything contemporary medicine could fully comprehend. Early psychoactive substances, engineered to bypass restraint and seize the nervous system itself. His notes documented systematic experimentation on dozens of human beings, many of them nameless, many of them never found. The prosecution laid bare how Cavendish's wealth and connections had enabled the work, how his staged death had been achieved through chemistry and performance, how the theatrical masks carved into each victim were symbols, declarations of belief. To Hartwell, emotion was a costume. Only through his work could it be torn away. Hartwell never recovered from exposure to his own creation. During the trial, he was often incapable of coherent speech, collapsing into uncontrollable terror without warning. The court eventually deemed him unfit for execution. His sentence was commuted to life confinement at Broadmoor Criminal Lunatic Asylum. He died there less than 2 years later, medical records citing cardiovascular failure brought on by perpetual fear. Geoffrey Cavendish was sentenced to life at Pentonville. Prison records describe recurring panic attacks, night terrors, and fits of uncontrollable laughter that echoed through the cell blocks. He died in 1890. Fellow inmates claimed his laughter lasted for hours before it finally fell silent. Inspector Harwick was promoted, though the honor brought little comfort. The case followed him for the rest of his life. He became a specialist in crimes involving scientific knowledge, consulted across the empire. Yet those closest to him noticed changes. He slept poorly. He avoided theaters. And on foggy nights, he walked longer than necessary before returning home. The Adelphi Theatre was renovated soon after. Workers uncovered hidden chambers beneath the stage containing chemical equipment, victim lists, and correspondence with associates in other cities. Over 50 prominent names were found, men and women who had narrowly escaped becoming demonstrations. How many others existed elsewhere was never known. Most of Hartwell's research was destroyed. Some was sealed away, classified, forgotten by design. The case forced Victorian society to confront an unsettling truth: that intelligence, education, and refinement offered no protection against moral collapse. That progress, when severed from conscience, could become something monstrous. Scotland Yard sealed the files in the winter of 1887. They remained closed for over 90 years. And yet, among the final pages, one detail stands unresolved. Multiple witnesses in multiple houses continued to report faint laughter in the weeks after the arrests. Not loud, not joyful, just enough to be unmistakable. Perhaps it was memory, perhaps suggestion, or perhaps the experiments reached further than anyone ever admitted. Because some echoes, once released, do not require a living source to endure.